It's The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. I'm thrilled to be talking to the writer-director of the new film Funny Pages, which just in its title alone lets us know his perspective on the world of media and popular culture. The film is, I think, a comedy that actually absorbs the punk ethos of 80s underground comics and turns this into like a punk comedy melodrama. It goes from references to people such as Peter Bagge. If you watch the end credits, you'll see Drew Friedman and Johnny Ryan and Dean Haspiel. But also, I think even the song selection, which feels like, in its way, like punk, a bunch of mono stuff like novelty records and primitive R&B from the 50s, sort of interlaced with this beautiful score by Sean O'Hagan that brings to mind for me Ennio Morricone's score for Once Upon a Time in the West. Anyway, let's bring on Owen Kline before we're out of time. Owen, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I mean, I'm astonished. You really keyed into, everything. I'm very flattered.
No, I just saw the movie, but I mean, I do have to say that it feels punk in that way that all that 80s stuff did feel punk, but it's also kind of funny too that it's the story of a guy who's sort of zealous about being a punk, looking for a father figure, which in itself is kind of punk.
The film starts, without ruining too much, it starts with a portfolio review and a teacher that's telling this kid, how talented he is. And then it kind of gets dark and the kid kind of questions this teacher who is sort of nurtured probably this underground comics appetite, probably was an aspiring cartoonist himself, this teacher. But, this night that just goes terribly wrong kind of makes him reassess everything and kind of puts the kid in a tailspin. It's a catalyst for the whole movie, I think. But yeah, I've never been a good student, college, high school, any of it. But, it's about those couple of renegade teachers. It was always about those couple of renegade teachers for me that sort of take you under their wing and show you records and movies and books and comics and whatever and sort of, blow your mind. Just losing that figure early on, it's sort of the quest is to sort of find another person like that.
Even if when you're rejecting sort of conventional hierarchical things like high school, when you find that teacher who encourages those things, that makes you feel like an adult, makes you feel like you're communicating with the world, it makes you think that there must be other people out there like that. And have that person in your life feels like, as Robert's teacher says to him, it feels subversive. And you're looking for more subversion, especially if you're in the suburbs where even now you still feel like you're hemmed in by conventionality.
I grew up in New York, never lived anywhere else. I still live in New York. Yeah, I was lucky to sort of have that in school and outside of school, because I hung around comic shops and weird record stores and worked in video stores and record stores. And for so long, you know what I mean? It's the same people, Rep Cinema, going to Film Forum and Anthology and all these places, growing up. It's just a lot of the same characters and faces and a lot of personality. It's a lot of personality in New York. So I got to know a lot of these people, these kinds of people pretty early and, paid attention to who was going to what and thinking about those characters, I guess. But I've just had a lot of older figures that have taken me under their wing in different phases. You know what I mean? Friendships and relationships too, but there is always that kind of that seniority factor that's sort of usually, maybe it's an ego thing sometimes it's genuinely just listen to me and this wisdom and I know what I'm talking about and you don't want to do this, you want to do this. And, to lose those people is difficult.
But also there's that thing, having somebody else confirm your taste. And finally, Robert leads everywhere with this taste.
I think that's everybody when they're young, especially if you want to make art in whatever capacity. You can see your fingerprint maybe and your influences maybe and how they coalesce on a page. But you're not there yet. Your skill isn't there yet. So you've established your snotty, tiny, microscopic, this is the window that this is what I'm interested in, and anything that does exist outside of this is bad or wrong or aesthetically repugnant or whatever. And I think that's a lot of that, at that self-conscious, very vulnerable, formative time for artists where your skill level does not meet your ambition or your taste, it's very, very difficult. And you need those people to sort of like keep you on. I've found those people, they have that bird's eye view and can help you.
Sure. I mean, and so much of this is, and I think it's really interesting the way this plays out in the movie, Robert wanting to be seen, like that scene where he goes and he's about to be hired by the public defender and she wants him to do a sketch and he's thrilled at the idea of getting to do this. And I think that's kind of wonderful because he finally wants to be acknowledged he wants people to see that he is an artist. He wants to be perceived in that way. And that appetite, which is, that's a kind of ambition that can drive a comedy. That ambition to be seen by people plays out, I think, in a lot of different ways throughout the film, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I guess that was what I was trying to tap into, I guess. The class clown kind of artist who's in the back of the class drawing this kind of stuff. And I mean, that was me when I was a very little kid. That aspect of it is drawn from my own kind of personal fabric, I guess. It was like, I was just like very interested in like cartoons and, cartooning with a capital C and the stuff, reading Beetle Bailey and Peanuts in the paper and everything. That was the like introduction to comics. And so I just really wanted to draw in a more kind of like wacky, dingy screwball style. So then later on discovering Peter Bagge was just kind of like, it's like how Crumb, when you look at Crumb and all of those funny animal comics he grew up on and everything, and children's comics and Mad, and how that all kind of got bottled together by him and spit out on the page. But no, like as a kid, like being the person when people kind of realize that you can draw and you realize you can kind of do it and caricature people, or, like people get really excited by that. It's like, wow, draw this. Can you draw this teacher or this person or something? And it's like, wow, it's very, that first validation. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's like the humorist, cartoonist. I mean, I feel like even, it's tough. People, that kind of style and that kind of uninhibited screwball cartooning style, it's really, it's not popular anymore. It's pretty esoteric at this point, which is strange.
By the way, it's The Treatment, which you can also hear at kcrw.com/The Treatment. My guest is a very talented writer-director, Owen Kline, whose new film is Funny Pages. I think, though, what's interesting about this is so much of the way you've cast a movie in terms of characters and faces lends itself to that. I mean, there is one sequence when he's sort of introduced into a sweaty basement apartment that could be right out of Peter Bagge or Dan Close or R. Crumb, complete with this constant layer of sweat that could be flying off like beads of sweat in the comic page. And I was thinking about that too when Robert sees his mentor teacher's book, his collection, and there's a drawing of Robert that looks like it could be, a cover of 8-Ball.
That art was done by Rick Altergott, who had a comic, Santa Graphics, around the same time as Clouds. He went to Pratt with Clouds, and they worked for Cracked in the 80s together. And he was like very kind of loyal to the sort of Wally Wood style, Rick Altergott. But so he did those drawings. But yeah, he's just got that. It's just a very esoteric drawing style. And Clouds and him really, I think, influenced each other's sensibilities at a very young age. You know what I mean? We're living in New York at that time. And, like 77, 78, they went to Pratt where I went, they, discovering the first Ramones record and everything, but also being into all this old wacky kind of stuff, Ed Wood movies and all that kind of Gen X inspirations that we all kind of like, that have been canonized now, of like trash junk culture or whatever. Crumb obviously was, like that. Crumb is like the great connector, I think. You know what I mean? If the people are into Crumb or something, then you might be able to have the similar, I don't know, sensibility or sense of humor or worldview or something. But like, I think that thing that you're talking about, it's like, that's what's interesting to me about Crumb is he had such an appetite at such an early age for cartooning and for this like older America, and how it kind of all comes together in his work. He just had a very backwards American upbringing because of Mad, because of Pogo and all this, and Disney comics and all of this crap, and how it feeds into when he's writing about our culture as a society. It is this kind of American satire that is entirely made up of a mid-century life in America.
There was something about Crumb and his embracing of that world that he was drawing about, but the drawing and illustrating, but also as a creator being kind of self-critical of his relationship to it. And we can see that, like I said, it emerged a bit in Gasoline Alley or in Pogo. And I feel like it's also in some ways what you're doing with Funny Pages too, with a character who's like trying to embrace this world, but also being, or at least the movie feels a bit self-critical.
Yes, it is. I mean, the movie is sort of questioning that naive impulse to sort of what it means to be an artist. And this kid has a really warped idea of what that means. He's not so far off, I don't think, but he really thinks he sort of needs to struggle and this and that. And there's some, I think it's self-destruction that he's running towards too. I think it's sort of a level of, he's been in a suburb so long he's sort of closed off to the world that when it opens up for him, he's able to sort of exist outside of the world in some way, which I think is also kind of the archetype of the cartoonist. The cartoonist is kind of on the outside looking in at the world. Did you ever read the Colin Wilson book, The Outsider?
Oh, yeah.
That book really shaped my understanding of that artist archetype and made it palatable as a real, and combining all of the ideologies of all of these people for hundreds of years, from Hogarth to, whatever the beats. That was later for me, that finding that kind of like an actually sophisticated approach to ultimately, how this kid thinks he's going to function in the world as an artist and as a person with an identity.
But it's funny too, because what the movie I think is sort of getting at, and there's that certainly in The Outsider as well, and then we see the dawning of that. And by the end of the movie, which is a beautiful shot that almost takes me back to The Graduate in some ways, is that recognition of self-awareness. Also realizing that outsider culture, and then Wilson gets at this, as time goes on, becomes institutionalized. So how do you wed yourself to something that both feeds that need that you have to be an outsider or to exist in that marginalized culture, but is in fact subsumed by the mainstream?
Well, exactly. It's like when you make a movie and people think, oh, well, I thought it was going to be this, but it was that. Label things in that way, and you go, oh, okay, well, you're coming in with this. But the kid is coming into this world with ideas clouded by the past, kind of a mixed up idea of those archetypes of what it means to be an artist, what it means to struggle as an artist. And obviously, yeah, he makes it hard for himself. I grew up in New York and playing in bands and making Xerox comics. And there was like a real do-it-yourself culture that was revived from the 80s in the mid-aughts growing up, in the mid-2000s, I guess. There was just a nice revival of that in the outer boroughs. And I think spending a lot of time at playing shows at, with 5 bands on the bill, and we're like the people that run the venue also live there in some secret weird closet room space, with like lava lamps and crap, just like, oh, wow, okay, this is the way you just kind of live and dive head first into bad thinking. If you're around this kind of stuff and going to punk shows and things and like thinking that squatting is cool, you know what I mean? Because it's like, oh, this is the real thing. These people are real. This is authentic. And that's a 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old, 18-year-old thing. But I think what you're talking about, that self-conscious kind of, I think that's a very interesting point. I'm a big fan of Gene Shepard, the old OWR.
Sure, absolutely.
The most famous thing he ever did was A Christmas Story, right? But he has this great episode called Lightning Strikes the Ham Radio. And he talks about how, like, as a little kid, you're not a part of the world. You are removed from it's this thing that exists outside of you. And then at some point, 10, 12, 13, you actually start thinking about the world and you in context. And that's where you start getting bugged. That's where you start having troubles, And I think that comes later for a lot of people, coming into self-awareness of your action. Because again, like the movie begins with this catalyst, starts in this way. And I think the rest of the movie, he's sort of trying to work through what happened in this room externally. And at the end, I think he's actually considering it for the first time, because it's sort of the movie's kind of bookended by these drawing lessons. He finds this kind of warped, what he thinks could be his like warped anti-hero that's going to guide him through. And, it doesn't turn out to be the guy, and it kind of knocks him on his ass a bit. And the ending of the movie, it came late. I mean, it's just that first look into the mirror and seeing yourself in the world in some way. And waking up is sort of what this movie's about. Not a lot is learned, but I think the movie in a way is about self-awareness in some way, or coming into self-awareness, because I think everything that he does between the beginning and the end is pretty unconscious.
We're talking about people who think squalor is ironic with my guest, Owen Kline. His feature film debut is Funny Pages.
That's not me. I don't feel that way, by the way. I just want to clear the air if you're just tuning in right now, What an introduction. That's where you're dropping the needle here.
Hey, I just want people to see the movie, because we got to get across this. The movie's really funny, and we can talk about all the undercurrents, the framing of it. But there's a lot of funny stuff in the movie. And I start off by talking about what I think is a really interesting and thoughtful way to use music. I mean, that mono feel of all those needle drop stuff that you've got, better with that really beautifully recorded and engineered score by Sean from Stereolab, among other places. So he's a guy who really knows how to create an aural environment. And so it's like we're going from externally what Robert is sort of hearing or what he wants to communicate to what's going on with him. And again, the idea of finding, and I heard a lot that I was reminded of Morricone, and particularly the Once Upon a Time in the West score. But I mean, that was an interesting sort of sonic counterpoint to create in the film that made me feel like I was in the hands of a real filmmaker.
All I'm thinking about is actually Duck You Sucker. And
Duck You Sucker, yes, that's it.
The great, it starts with, not a lot of Western, let alone spaghetti Westerns, start with a urination scene, and that movie does. And it's one of the best soundtracks he ever did.
Or the fart sound, wah, 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 that then goes into that lovely sort of invention for John Whistle. And again, all these sort of discordant elements, the sort of punk element, even in Morricone. You respond in your way to punk everywhere, don't you?
Well, Morricone was I don't know if you saw the new documentary about him, but he was going as a classically trained, I can't remember what instrument he was training for. He had some sort of hard-ass teacher, some of the music instructor who's just, and there's footage in it. You see John Cage coming to the school at the same time and making all these noises, and they cut to the, the purist classical teacher, who doesn't think Morricone's ever going to be good enough, and he's like got his head in his hands listening to this. But that was so influential to Morricone that he started to incorporate, playing alongside all these lush instruments and incredible arrangements of string and warm brass, which is exactly what Sean O'Hagan, who's a genius of the High Llamas and Stereolab, who did our score. This is the guy that almost reunited the Beach Boys and tried to get, Brian Wilson back on track and be the avant pop guy. But I digress. Morricone, and we were listening to that Morricone stuff a lot, and we were thinking about Hefty and all these different Italian composers, really, and doing something more lush. But Sean is this brilliant. He's the guy you bring in if you need brass, warm brass, and string arrangements.
Gosh, there's so much I could talk to you about, clearly. But one of the things that's so much fun about the movie is you're casting not just for faces, but for what the actors can bring to these scenes. What's fascinating about this, too, is in this way, it's kind of like being a reader of a daily comic strip, where each place that Robert goes to is its own separate world. And he's plunged into that in the way you would be if you followed Apartment 3G, I'm sorry to do that, or Gasoline Alley, or Pogo. These places that are about these worlds in which there's a devotion to detail by the people who live in them. And if you're going to connect with them, you have to connect to that same kind of almost OCD quality they have about being in these worlds. They don't want things disturbed, and there are certain rules. These are universes within universes. And to make sure you cast with people who look like they live in these places rather than actors, again, who have skill levels that they can bring to bear, that just from the way they vocalize roles, we feel that we've seen these people, we hear from the way they even breathe in these rooms. It feels like a very accomplished thing to do.
Thank you. And I really tried my best to blend first-timers, I'll call them, as opposed to non-actors. I think it's like, I don't believe in non-actors. I think there's only first-timers. And, the people you want to cast in those roles are the people that don't change a molecule when you put them on camera. You put an actor on camera, the second you yell action, they step into another zone. And you're, why couldn't you just act like the way you were acting before? Why do you have to act, But people that have a strong personality in some way, or that aren't afraid, that just aren't afraid. It's a beautiful thing when that happens. And I really, I think growing up in New York, there's a lot of the extra people, even in a small role. I always think of Jonathan Demme saying, that when you have even a walk-on character, a cameo, just like in that moment, that incidental character actor is the star of the movie. I feel like most things, you know what I mean? It's just like very, that central casting thing of like, all right, well, we really need the really wacky guy, like a really wacky guy that seems like he's like an academic, but he's like angry. And we'll get, I won't insult an actor, but we'll get this or that guy. I mean, like even something at the funeral, you know what I mean? Like I had the two people in the funeral scene. My friend Randy Costanza, who was, he's sort of like an old indie rock guy that like, he's got all these stories of like, he was just adjacent to so many things. Like he sang in the band Don Caballero before they became an instrumental band, or he drove the tour bus for Pavement and stuff, but he's just a really funny personality. I put him in the movie, and a friend of his passed away recently. And I just said, can you just talk about your friend, and we filmed him for 20 minutes or something. And what ends up being there is the best 15 seconds. You get different performances out of different people in different ways. There isn't one method, and everybody approaches performance and, filmmaking in a different way, in a different style. And I've just found that ultimately you're running towards strong personalities, right? Trying to write strong voices and cast strong personalities.
Owen, you got to come back. My guest is Owen Kline. Go make another movie. His first film is Funny Pages. It's in movie theaters. You should see it there because it was shot on film. Owen, I can't thank you enough for doing this, man. Thank you.
Thank you. This is such a pleasure. So nice to meet you.